In the autumn of 1893, deep beneath the mountains outside Cripple Creek, a team of miners expected to uncover another rich vein of gold. Instead, they pulled something from the darkness that wasn't recorded in any geological survey, wasn't mentioned in any mining report, and, according to the men who saw it, should never have existed beneath Colorado's granite. Within days, unfamiliar officials arrived without explanation. The miners were sent home. The entrance was sealed behind heavy steel. No public report. No official record. Only silence. For more than a century, whispers have claimed that whatever emerged from that forgotten drift wasn't merely valuable. It was something people wanted erased from history. Tonight, we'll follow every surviving clue to uncover what may have happened beneath Cripple Creek in 1893, and why sealing the mine forever was considered the only option. If you're fascinated by forgotten history, hidden discoveries, and mysteries buried beneath the official record, subscribe to Lost Secret Timeline and join us as we uncover the secrets history tried to leave underground. Because sometimes, the greatest discoveries are the ones no one was ever meant to find. By the autumn of 1893, Cripple Creek, Colorado, had become one of the fastest-growing gold districts in America. Thousands of prospectors poured into the mountains, driven by rumors of fortunes waiting beneath the granite. Around the clock, stamp mills thundered through the valleys, while narrow-gauge railroads hauled ore from the hillsides. Every new shaft promised wealth, and every fresh tunnel carried the hope of striking another rich vein. Among the dozens of active workings was a little-known side passage, locales simply called the Drift. It wasn't famous. It wasn't especially profitable. In fact, company records described it as nearly exhausted after months of disappointing excavation. Most crews expected the tunnel to be abandoned before winter. Still, one final survey was ordered. The assignment seemed routine. A small crew of experienced miners was sent underground to follow a narrow seam that had begun to bend away from the main workings. Their instructions were simple. Determine whether the vein continued deeper or whether the drift should be permanently closed. At first, everything appeared exactly as expected. The walls were rough granite, broken by thin veins of quartz that glittered under the glow of carbide lamps. Picks echoed through the confined passage, and clouds of dust drifted slowly through the stale, underground air. Then everything changed. As one miner struck the rock, the sound that answered wasn't the dull crack of solid granite. It rang, metallic, hollow. The crew cleared away loose stone, expecting to uncover an empty pocket or a natural cavern. Instead, their lanterns revealed a smooth passage, unlike anything they had seen before. Its walls were unnaturally straight, its corners sharply defined, and its surface bore no signs of blasting or hand tools. Stranger still, none of the official mine surveys showed any tunnel in that location. Somehow, hidden beneath one of America's busiest goldfields, they had uncovered a passage that, on paper, did not exist. For several long moments, no one spoke. The miners stood frozen, their lanterns casting unsteady light across walls that looked nothing like the rough granite surrounding them. Every instinct told them this passage didn't belong beneath Cripple Creek. It wasn't the work of nature, and it certainly wasn't the work of any mining crew they knew. Curiosity overcame caution. Stepping inside, they noticed the floor was remarkably level, as though it had been carefully shaped long before the first gold prospector ever climbed these mountains. The walls were fitted with massive blocks of dark stone, joined so precisely that even the edge of a knife couldn't slip. Between them, there were no drill marks, no chisel scars, and no sign of explosives. Only smooth surfaces that had somehow endured untouched beneath layers of solid rock. Then they saw the markings, faint symbols stretched across the stone in repeating patterns, their edges softened by time, but still unmistakably deliberate. None of the miners could read them. They weren't numbers used by surveyors, nor the initials left behind by earlier crews. They resembled no language anyone recognized. yet their careful arrangement suggested purpose rather than decoration. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the world became. The familiar sounds of the mine, dripping water, shifting timber, distant hammer strikes, faded into an unnatural silence. Even the air felt different, colder, heavier, carrying a stale stillness that made every breath seem reluctant. Then the passage ended. A massive wall of collapsed stone blocked the way forward, as though the tunnel had been deliberately buried long ago. As the crew examined the rubble, one miner raised his lantern and held up a trembling hand. "Did you hear that?" The others listened. At first, nothing. Then, from somewhere beyond the collapsed wall, a slow, measured breath. Not the whistle of escaping air, not the settling of rock, but something that sounded disturbingly alive. The crew remained motionless, straining to hear the sound again. Silence. No second breath. No shifting stone. Only the uneasy stillness that had settled over the hidden passage. The foreman finally broke the tension, assuming the noise had come from trapped air behind the collapse. He ordered the men to clear just enough debris to determine what lay beyond. Picks struck loose rock, shovels scraped across broken stone, and hour by hour, a narrow opening began to emerge. Then, one final boulder gave way. A rush of cold, stale air rolled through the passage, extinguishing one lantern and sending dust swirling into the darkness. The miners covered their faces, waiting for the air to settle before raising their remaining lights toward the opening. What they saw stopped every one of them in place. Beyond the breach stood a chamber unlike anything found in an ordinary gold mine. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness far above their lanterns. Massive stone walls curved outward into a space so vast that the light could not reach the opposite side. There were no timber supports, no veins of quartz, no evidence that explosives had ever carved the room from solid rock. It looked constructed. The floor was strangely smooth, interrupted only by enormous stone pillars rising into the darkness. Every surface appeared untouched, preserved as though no human foot had entered. For centuries, no one spoke. Even the most experienced miners struggled to understand what they were looking at. Then one of the younger workers slowly lifted his lantern higher. At the far end of the chamber, something caught the light. Not gold, not crystal. A single, brilliant reflection flashed back through the darkness. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. The men stared into the blackness, waiting for it to happen again. Whatever had reflected their lantern, it wasn't where they expected it to be. It was higher, much higher, as though something deep inside the chamber had just turned to look at them. No one moved. Every lantern remained fixed on the darkness where the reflection had appeared. The chamber was so vast that their light dissolved long before it reached the walls, leaving most of the space hidden beyond a curtain of black. The foreman gathered his nerve and led the crew a few cautious steps inside. The air was unnaturally cold. Each footstep echoed for several seconds, as though the chamber extended far beyond what their eyes could see. Dust lay undisturbed across the smooth stone floor, suggesting that nothing had crossed it for an unimaginable length of time. Then one miner noticed something partially buried beneath the dust. He knelt, brushed the surface clean, and froze. It wasn't ore. It wasn't quartz. It wasn't any natural rock formation. A massive object emerged from the floor with perfectly smooth curves and sharply defined edges, its dark surface reflecting the lantern light like polished stone, yet showing no visible tool marks, cracks, or signs of weathering. It looked as though it had been shaped with impossible precision and then left untouched beneath the mountain. Nearby stood several towering stone columns, each carved with the same unfamiliar symbols they had seen in the hidden passage. The markings wrapped around the pillars in deliberate patterns, repeating again and again as if they carried a message no one present could understand. The miners searched for an explanation, an abandoned excavation, an early settlement. Anything that made sense. Nothing did. The chamber resembled neither a mine nor a natural cave. It looked intentional, as though it had been built for a purpose that had long since been forgotten. The foreman's expression changed. Without another word, he lowered his lantern and looked back toward the entrance. His voice, usually calm beneath pressure, carried an urgency none of the men had ever heard before. "Drop your tools." A long silence followed. Then came the order that ended the exploration. "Everyone, out. Right now." By the time the miners reached the surface, the story had already begun to spread through the camp. Men who had worked beside them noticed the shaken expressions, the abandoned tools, and the unusual order to suspend all activity at the drift. Questions traveled faster than answers, but no one from the crew was willing to explain what they had seen beneath the mountain. Before dawn the next morning, unexpected visitors arrived. They wore no mining uniforms. They carried no company insignia. Instead, a small group of well-dressed officials stepped quietly through the camp, accompanied by armed guards and engineers who headed directly toward the forgotten drift. Their names were never entered into the mine's daily log, and no public announcement explained their presence. The entrance was immediately placed under guard. Every worker assigned to that section of the mine was dismissed for the day and instructed not to return until further notice. Some were told they had been reassigned. Others simply found their names missing from the next payroll sheet, as though they had never worked there at all. Years later, researchers comparing surviving payroll ledgers noticed something unusual. Several miners believed to have entered the hidden passage could no longer be traced in company employment records after that week. Their wages stopped without explanation, and official documents offered no reason for their sudden disappearance from the books. Then came the wagons. Long before sunrise, covered government wagons climbed the narrow mountain road toward the sealed drift. Witnesses later recalled watching heavy wooden crates being loaded under armed supervision. No markings identified the cargo, and no inventory listed what had been removed from the mine. As the final wagon disappeared into the morning fog, one local worker quietly asked a guard what had been taken from the mountain. The guard didn't answer. He simply looked back toward the drift, as if whatever remained underground was even more important than whatever had already been carried away. Within days, the atmosphere in Cripple Creek had changed. The miners still gathered in boarding houses and saloons after long shifts, but conversations grew quieter whenever the forgotten drift was mentioned. Some claimed the crew had uncovered a hidden vault. Others insisted they had broken into ruins far older than the mining district itself. Every version of the story ended the same way. No one was allowed back inside. At first, local newspapers seemed eager to report the unusual closure. Brief notices mentioned suspended operations and unexplained activity near one section of the mine. A few reporters even hinted that something extraordinary had interrupted excavation. Then, the coverage stopped. Almost overnight, the articles disappeared. Planned follow-up stories were never published, and the mysterious closure simply vanished from the headlines. In later editions, the drift was mentioned only as another exhausted tunnel, abandoned because it was no longer profitable. To most readers, that explanation was enough, but not everyone accepted it. Years later, while examining private collections from the region, historians uncovered the Warn, journal of a local surveyor who had worked near the district during that same period. Most of his entries described ordinary measurements, weather conditions, and routine mining observations. One page was different. The handwriting became hurried, the ink uneven, as though the words had been written in haste. He described unusual security around the drift, unfamiliar officials arriving before sunrise, and repeated warnings to stay away from the sealed entrance. Near the bottom of the page, he added one final observation. He claimed the chamber had not been destroyed, only hidden. Then he wrote a single sentence that has puzzled researchers ever since. Stone can close a doorway, but it cannot bury what still waits behind it. After that entry, the journal continued. But the mysterious chamber was never mentioned again. Once the officials finished their work, the forgotten drift was no longer treated as an abandoned mine. It became a restricted site. A temporary fence surrounded the entrance. Armed watchmen rotated through day and night, and anyone wandering too close was ordered to leave without explanation. To the people of Cripple Creek, the message was unmistakable. Whatever had happened beneath the mountain, it was still being guarded. Among the surviving accounts is the journal attributed to the last man assigned to the night watch. Unlike company reports, his notes were personal, written in plain language at the end of each shift. The earliest entries were uneventful, describing cold mountain winds, long hours, and the silence that settled over the sealed entrance after sunset. Then the tone began to change. He wrote that the silence wasn't complete. Some nights, he claimed to hear faint sounds coming from deep inside the mountain. They weren't the sharp cracks of shifting rock or the distant trickle of underground water. Noises every experienced miner recognized. These sounds were slower, rhythmic, almost deliberate. He described long pauses, followed by what he believed were heavy knocks echoing from somewhere beyond the welded barrier. Always the same pattern, always after midnight. At first, he blamed exhaustion. Then he admitted something he could no longer explain. The sounds seemed to answer one another, as though they were moving deeper within the sealed passage. His final entries grew noticeably shorter. His handwriting became uneven, with words crossed out and rewritten, suggesting a man struggling to describe something he barely understood. The last page contained only one complete sentence. If the mountain opens again, do not be the first to enter. There were no more entries. According to local accounts, the guard failed to report for duty the following evening. His journal remained, but the man who wrote it was never officially accounted for. In the weeks that followed, the Forgotten Drift underwent a closure unlike any other in the Cripple Creek district. Ordinarily, abandoned mine passages were blocked with timber, filled with loose rock, or simply left to collapse naturally over time. It was the fastest and least expensive way to close an exhausted tunnel. This drift was different. Teams of engineers arrived with heavy steel plates, iron supports, and equipment rarely used for sealing a mine. Instead of allowing the entrance to cave in, they reinforced the opening, anchored massive steel barriers into the surrounding granite, and welded every visible seam shut. When the work was finished, there was no doorway, no gap, no visible passage back into the mountain. It was as though the entrance had been deliberately erased rather than abandoned. The official explanation remained unchanged. The drift was said to be unstable, unsafe, and no longer worth excavating. Yet several workers who participated in the final stages of the sealing project later described details that never appeared in company reports. They claimed the welding crews were instructed to work continuously, even after sunset, under the supervision of armed officials who refused to leave the site. More unsettling were the sounds. As the last steel plates were being secured, a few workers reported hearing faint echoes from the opposite side of the barrier. Not the groaning of settling rock, not the hiss of escaping air. The noises came in slow, measured intervals, striking the steel from somewhere deep inside the sealed passage. One worker later compared it to someone testing a locked door, not trying to break through, but confirming that it was still there. The foreman ordered everyone to ignore the sounds and finish the welds. By sunrise, the job was complete. The drift had disappeared behind solid steel and stone. But according to the men who sealed it, the mountain did not fall silent. Something behind the barrier kept knocking. More than a century has passed since the Forgotten Drift was sealed. The miners are gone. The witnesses have faded into history, and the mountain has kept its silence. Yet the mystery never completely disappeared. In recent decades, independent historians, mining researchers, and local archivists have revisited the surviving records, comparing forgotten survey maps, century-old photographs, engineering sketches, and personal journals that had remained scattered across museums and private collections. Individually, none of the documents seemed remarkable. Together, they raised difficult questions. Several early mine maps showed passageways that no longer appeared on later surveys. Certain engineering drawings hinted at underground sections that were quietly removed from revised editions. Even photographs taken during the expansion of the district appeared to show an entrance where, according to official records, no entrance should have existed. Then came the testimony. Though often second-hand and impossible to verify in every detail, accounts collected from descendants of miners described remarkably similar stories: an unexplained closure, unusual security, and a hidden chamber that was never discussed openly after 1893. None of these accounts proves what the miners actually found, but together they suggest that something interrupted ordinary mining operations in a way that official reports never fully explained. Modern geological studies have added another layer to the mystery. Some researchers have noted that portions of the mountain remain difficult to reconcile with early excavation records, leaving open the possibility that sealed voids or undocumented chambers could still exist beyond the known workings. If that's true, then whatever the miners uncovered may never have been removed. It may still rest beyond collapsed stone and welded steel, hidden beneath more than a century of silence. The evidence remains incomplete. The questions remain unanswered. And somewhere beneath the granite of Cripple Creek, history may still be waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. More than 100 years have passed since the entrance to the forgotten drift disappeared behind steel and stone. Time has erased the faces of the miners. The official records remain incomplete. The eyewitnesses are long gone. Yet the questions have never faded. History often remembers great discoveries through monuments, museums, and preserved documents. But just as often, history is shaped by what was never fully recorded. Stories, reduced to rumors, files quietly forgotten, and places left unexplored for generations. Perhaps the forgotten drift was exactly what the official reports claimed: an exhausted section of mine, abandoned because it was unsafe and no longer profitable. Or perhaps the surviving journals, altered maps, and unexplained engineering decisions point toward something far more unusual: an underground chamber that challenged the understanding of the people who first entered it. The truth is that we may never know. Legends grow over time, memories become distorted, and missing records invite speculation. Separating fact from folklore is never easy, especially when so much has been lost to history. But one fact remains impossible to ignore. The drift was not abandoned in an ordinary way. It was secured, guarded, and sealed with extraordinary effort. Whether those actions protected people from danger or protected a secret from the public remains a question history has yet to answer. Perhaps the mountain has already revealed everything it ever intended to reveal. Or perhaps it is still keeping one final secret beneath the granite, waiting for the day someone uncovers what the miners saw in the autumn of 1893. And if that day ever comes, will it rewrite history or confirm that some discoveries are buried for a reason? If you enjoyed this journey into history's forgotten mysteries, subscribe to Lost Secret Timeline and become part of a community that explores the stories hidden between the pages of official history. Until our next investigation, remember, not every secret is lost to time. Some are simply waiting to be found.